chat me some questions that called the County Equity Journey, Progress and Insights. Thank you all for joining us today. We have interpretation in Spanish available. You want to go to the interpretation global link below. Everyone will need to do this and select either English or Spanish channel. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Belen to translate.
Buenos días a todos. Para aquellos que necesiten traducción al español, tienen que ir al símbolo de abajo en el menú y seleccionar su canal. Si prefieren en inglés o si prefieren en español, hay traducción simultánea en un canal. Cuando selecciona, va a poder escuchar su idioma de preferencia. Gracias.
Thank you, Belen. I'm Shireen Malik Afzali, she, her pronouns. I'm the Chief Equity Officer for the County of San Mateo. Before getting started, I'd like to honor and affirm the rights of the Ohlone and other Indigenous peoples who call the unceded territories of the San Francisco Bay Area their traditional homeland. They are the descendants of the villages seen and unseen. We pay respect to ancestors, elders, relatives of Indigenous peoples for their historic and current contributions to San Mateo County and commit to ongoing efforts to bring about healing, inclusivity, and deeper collaborative partnerships. Next slide. I'm joined here today and regularly at the Office of Racial and Social Justice with my colleagues Belen Sierra, Equity and Belonging Manager, as well as Andrew Kanak, Equity and Belonging Associate. This webinar, but all the work would not be possible without this amazing small but mighty team at the Office of Racial and Social Justice. Next slide. Just a few logistics. You can chat to the host with any Zoom challenges that you have. Andrew is helping to troubleshoot those. This meeting is being recorded for those that might not be able to join us today, for us to make available to others. Along the presentation, please submit your questions into the Q&A functions throughout the webinar. That's located in the bottom where you see Q&A. Click on it, add in your questions at any point. We're going to take breaks throughout the process to answer questions. We also have an email available where you can share your feedback at any point at any time going forward or during the session. And at the very end, we will have an evaluation survey for you to share your feedback on the webinar, but also the feedback on the work. Next slide. Our time together, we will shortly have a welcome by Supervisor Corso. Thank you, Supervisor Corso, for joining us. I'll share some background, which would be grounding us in the equity framework that we have built in partnership with staff, leadership, as well as community partners. We'll take time for Q&A, reflections, and feedback. Then we'll go through some milestones along the journey that we've been on since 2021. Again, take questions and reflections. Then we'll discuss some lessons learned, opportunities, challenges, and take some feedback, and then close out with a survey. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Supervisor Corso, who has been a champion for equity efforts since joining the board. I do want to just say quickly that she is the winner of the 2024 Equity Champion Award for the Board of Supervisors. Our first champion was Supervisor Slocum in 2023, and it's very fitting that Supervisor Corso was nominated for this year's winner. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Appreciate the chance to talk with you all this morning. I would just want to start off and thank Shireen, Belen, and oh my goodness,
Andrew.
And Andrew, that's right, sorry. And Andrew for all of their work in putting this together. I think back to kind of how my equity journey started. And if I am honest about that, I think it started before I even knew what equity really meant. For me, that was, growing up and in my neighborhood and realizing that things were different for people that live just a couple blocks away. And as I, was elected to the school board, I got to do real equity training, and I kind of think of it as just, a different lens that I started to view the world through. Real equity work takes a lot of patience, a lot of humility, a lot of forgiveness at times. We are humans, we're not perfect people. Um, but going through the journey of learning about equity and what it looks like and how we can, you know, help equity work progress or not, it takes a lot of reflection. So I'm grateful that all of you are here engaging in this work. I know for me, I'm really proud of the fact that my team and I, for the District 2 office, are officially part of the racial, I'm sorry, the equity plan for the county. We're the first Board of Supervisors district to do that. And, you know, all of the work that this team has done, it touches our community in many different ways, but sometimes it's not so obvious, right? Sometimes it's just a different mindset. It's just a different choice, small choices at times here and there. But that's how we get to a place of more inclusion, more welcoming, more belonging. So yeah, welcome all. Good morning, and I hope you enjoy this training. I know I do, and I've done all kinds of equity trainings, but every time it's just kind of a chance to ground yourself, to learn, and then to think about how you want to take that with you when you do your day-to-day work. So take care, y'all. I'll be listening in, but hand it over back to Shireen.
Thank you, Supervisor Corso, for being here, showing your leadership, but also for having demonstrated leadership over institutional equity. It's so important. We often talk about how equity is institutionalized, racism is institutionalized, but we often don't have the resources and the leadership to really focus on institutional changes and advancing equity institutionally. So thank you for that leadership and ongoing support. I do want to just to set your expectations so you can know that we will be providing a bit more of an update on the work that the equity journey that's been countywide going forward during this session. And the grounding on the framework is really to make sure to catch folks up who haven't had a chance to hear it yet. It will be less focused like a training. I want to just pause because we have more people have joined us and just remind everyone that we have Spanish interpretation available in a channel. Go down to the bottom globe icon, click on it and select the channel, either English or Spanish. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Belen to translate that.
Buenos días para aquellos que recién se conectaron. Este webinar está traduciéndose en español y en inglés y tenemos que seleccionar el idioma de preferencia. En el menú de abajo va a haber un icono de un mundo que dice Interpretation y de ahí puede seleccionar el inglés o el español, pero todos tenemos que seleccionar un canal. Gracias.
Thank you, Belen. So first, just to ground us in the equity framework, I want to take us to our pandemic as a portal. Next slide, please. In 2020, I will say that the President Slocum, we mentioned he was our 2023 equity champion, but in 2020, when he took his presidency in January, before the pandemic started, he asked that we all, as a staff, take an equity lens to all of our efforts and ask the county executive to think through and make that come to fruition. Very quickly, the pandemic hit and illuminated the inequities that many of us were experiencing or aware of for many years now, but illuminated that to a much broader population. The inequities that we experience from geography and race, both around the COVID COVID infections, but also around vaccine uptake, who had trust in government and who didn't. And it also made us realize how our fate was collectively held together. That if we wanted to all be healthy, we needed to all be able to be healthy and have the conditions that help us be safe from COVID. And the other thing that happened right around that same time is the racial reckoning across the United States that was also very localized, where we heard from a lot of our community members who wanted to see changes, who wanted to see a government they could trust, that they felt was safe for them. So with that, our county executive recognized, as well as our board of supervisors, that there needed to be more leadership in identifying where we had gaps in advancing equity, where we had opportunities to accelerate advancing equity, and brought on a chief equity officer in May of 2021. One of the first things I set out to do was identify, how do we define equity? Next slide. And we utilized this definition from a national organization that worked across the United States to define equity as just and fair inclusion into a society where all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. So it's clear that the work to achieving equity for us is to create the conditions that allow all to achieve their full potential. And if you go to the next slide, I want to make sure that we don't conflate the ideas of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging too loosely, because while they're all very related, they're different things. And so we went through and identified different definitions and a framework for how they come together, where the focus is to bring inclusion, equity, and diversity together to create a sense of belonging, where there's an authentic participation and power and design of development, so that people don't feel just included in other people's spaces, but feel like welcomed agents in the creation of the space with equitable distributions of power. Next slide. It became clear, especially as a government entity, how important it is to differentiate between equity and equality. If you click on the next slide, what you see on the first image is that if the focus is for people to reach their full potential, is to, in this case, in this image, to see the baseball game, what you see is providing everyone with the same resource, the same box to stand on, does not help everyone achieve their full potential. And that's because people have different starting points in life and they face different barriers throughout life. And oftentimes that's based on identity. If you look at the next slide, next picture, what you see is providing different resources so that everyone can reach their full potential, irrespective of where their starting points are and the barriers that they face, with the ultimate goal of journeying to justice, where we remove the barriers and even out the playing field. Next slide. It's important to remember the context for those different starting points and different barriers. And they're really what we call the root causes of inequities. It's important to remind ourselves before we look at disparate outcomes, because we often will blame individual or personal responsibility without a reminder of the historic and current inequities that many of our populations face. I'm not going to go through all of the pieces in the slide, but I do want to recognize that there are systems of oppression and discrimination that have been there then embedded into our policies, very specifically in government policies and organizational policies. And oftentimes when they are not embedded directly as policies, they were and are practiced. And so these root causes that have been reinforced through policies and practices have enormous impacts on the opportunities that and the conditions that many of our community members face. Next slide. And these differentiated starting points and barriers don't influence or affect just a small portion or a minority of our population. In San Mateo County, we're 63% people of color, nearly 2/3. That's a large population. We have a large immigrant population with over 1/3 foreign born, and more than 50% of our children are born to immigrant parents. the impacts of the previous slide, the discriminatory systems, the policies and practices, therefore impact the majority of our population here in San Mateo County. One of the ways that you see that and the cycle of poverty and inequities is in this next slide, where you see third grade reading level in comparison to household income and how they're negatively correlated. What you see on the y-axis are the different elementary school districts in San Mateo County. And the darker, let's see, how does it look for you? Yeah, the lighter blue line, which is about like a green line, is the percentage of third graders that are meeting meeting third grade reading standards, which we understand based on research to be a predictor of high school graduation rate and often a lot of the success outcomes related to economic opportunity. The darker blue line is the percentage of free and reduced lunch programs, lunch meals within that school. So what you're looking at, as you can see, for example, with Portola Valley Elementary School having 87% third grade reading proficiency and only 6% students on free and reduced lunch program, versus when you go down to, for example, Ravenswood School District, where you have a 6%, just almost the opposite. You have 6% third grade reading proficiency and 78% of students on free and reduced lunch program. You see an inverse relationship between those two things. So you see low-income families not able to meet the third grade reading level and therefore have the kind of success in life that it's predicted. In addition, if you go to the next slide, we'll see that our economy is set up where we have a lot of prosperity. The Brookings Metro Monitor names our regions first and second for most prosperous large metropolitan region in the United States out of 56 regions, and yet we are 46th and 54th in racial inclusion in that prosperity. So while we know how to get it right for people to live in prosperity and have opportunity, we don't evenly distribute that. Next slide. So with those realities, what we wanted to do is identify how is it that we as a county can commit to advancing equity in the community. What you see on the bottom right corner is this achieving equity, which is that people experience the conditions they need to reach their full potential, and those disparities by race, income, and other identities or characteristics are eliminated. Go ahead, Andrew, and click through the next few slides. There you go. And what we recognized and worked with community partners on was recognizing that the largest transformation or the largest opportunity input we have towards people experiencing those conditions is looking across at all of our resources, all of our staff, all of our personnel, all of the programs and services that we run, and bringing an equity lens into all of those operations so that we can, as an institution in the county that has a lot of influence, can show more equitable resource allocation, policies, services, processes, as well as a more equitable democracy where everyone has a voice. And that together creates a more equitable culture where in the community we see a shift in the narrative of who belongs, who San Mateo County is. Other jurisdictions and organizations commit to equity so that we are building additional momentum, and all have power and space to share their aspiration and needs in order to create those conditions where everyone can reach their full potential. And from there, what we did was develop an infrastructure within the county. On this next slide, what you see is that the Office of Racial and Social Justice is named in the center. Andrew, if you could go ahead and click to the next slide. We really are a small but mighty team that's held together through a lot of other infrastructure. We have a core equity team we have 29 departments within the county, and each of those departments hold very different focus areas, functions, Some are large, some are small, some are internal, some are external. We have anything from the sheriff's office to a public hospital to Department of Agriculture or Public Works. And so every one of those departments brings a voice into the core equity team where they share their challenges, the opportunities, the things that they have tried to advance equity, and also brings back the countywide efforts to advance equity, the tools, the resources back to their departments. And many of those departments have equity teams where they're really identifying ways to how can our department, through our function, utilize the countywide tools to advance equity through the functions that we hold. We also have an equity ordinance that I'll talk a little bit more about, and have been working closely with our community equity partners to really understand what is the right theory of change, what are the efforts that we need to create a more equitable county. Next slide. Being a new function for the county, we realized that we also need to try new things, build new infrastructure, as I mentioned, build tools, pilot them, and then operationalize them at scale. So while we have been advancing the various outcome areas from services, resources to democracy, we've been piloting small tools and then taking them to scale, always learning, always deepening our efforts, and before that we take it to such a large institution. And this is an ongoing, we say, rinse, repeat, and deepen. So I wanted to make sure we were all grounded in the same foundational framework for how we're viewing and advancing equity on this journey, and want to take any questions that you might have at this point. Don't see any questions here. One thing I will note is that I didn't come up with any of this on my own, this framework. One of the first things I did, and I'll show you in our next section, was I did more than 30 presentations and held forums with the community partners to ask the question, does this definition resonate? Is this the right activity and actions for the county? What else do we need to be thinking of? What other infrastructure is needed? As well as with staff who really know the work well. So this was a joint effort with many of our partners to make sure that we're getting this framework right, because all of the work stems from this framework. Okay. I'm going to keep us moving, and I imagine that many of you this wasn't the first time you've seen this framework. So the next sort of section in this webinar is to share with you some of the key milestones around our equity journey to date. By no means is our journey complete, so this is just sharing with you where we are now. If you go to the next slide, I'm starting with 2020, which is when I took the helm as a Chief Equity Officer position. But I want to acknowledge prior to that, in fact, prior to that, I was in the health department and was the health equity officer, the senior manager for policy planning and equity. So there have been focus on equity within departments, certainly in the community, countywide, and in many cities for many decades. In spring of 2021, the Chief Equity Officer position was hired. I was hired into that role from the health department. And one of the main things I did in the spring, I was hired on in April, or no, was it May of 2021, was really decide, let's make sure we know what this role is. This was the first time we've ever had this role of a Chief Equity Officer. What does it mean to be a Chief Equity Officer for the county? So one was really helping form the role and the position, then working on those definitions and frameworks that I just shared with you, making sure that we are ground truthing that with community, and then really beginning to talk about the history and giving texture to what is equity and what have been the experiences of our community members who have experience in equities. We partnered with the library and behavioral health recovery services on a webinar series called Equity Through Art. And in that space, we had panels of various racial groups in San Mateo County come share their history, whether it was a Filipino community talking about the immigration, the arts, or it was the Japanese community talking about their experiences historically, including the internment camps, to the Black community and the Nairobi movement in East Palo Alto, really having the voices of our communities of color on display, sharing the history of our county, as well as their current experiences, to bring about a narrative of the county and understanding where do we start from, what have been the experiences, so we know where we're going. We launched that core equity team I mentioned to you. And importantly, in the fall of 2021, we passed a resolution with Supervisor Slocum at the helm, as well as Supervisor Canepa, around racial equity. In that resolution, the county government acknowledged that government has been problematic and has been complicit in the creation of many of the inequities that our communities experience today, and that there were very specific actions that we needed to take, including advancing a core equity team and developing across the board a countywide equity action plan where each department would have specific actions that they would commit to. If we go to the next slide, so in 2022, we developed our first countywide racial and social equity action plan. And now we're actually in our 3.0 action plan that builds on what we first started. Each of our departments submitted, based on where they were in their learning and their equity journey, submitted some early steps into advancing equity within their departments. That includes performance measures, community impacts, and timelines. We also looked at just recognizing that our service side of our efforts was not all the resources that we hold in our county. We are one of the largest employers in San Mateo County, and we have a lot of economic impact within the county. We passed with the Board of Supervisors, again, with the support of Supervisor Slocum as well as Supervisor Groom at the time, we passed the Anchor Institution Resolution, which specifically said that we would look at the business side of our operations, what economic opportunities that the county has access to, the quality jobs, benefits. We spend about $500 million a year in goods and services. Where do we spend that money? How do we spend that money? As well as invest the larger sort of set of investments that we have. And the Anchor Institution Resolution also identified some specific actions that we would take. So we wanted to make sure that those commitments and the acknowledgement also culminated in some specific actions that the government would take. We also launched a staff survey. We recognized that if the goal was to impact how each staff implements their work and brings an equity lens into their work, we needed to shift the culture. And that required us to understand, what does staff already know? What does staff think is important? And how do we move the work forward? So we had our first staff survey at that point. We also were still in the middle of recovery and took the lead on working with the Stanford Gardner Center on a large-scale community engagement process to make sure that impacted community members had a voice in how the large, I think it was ultimately 72 tranches of 74 million each were spent in San Mateo County to make sure that we were recovering equitably from the pandemic. In spring of 2022, we launched the concept of having each department requiring equity performance measures as part of their budgeting process. That is still to this day integrated into our budgeting process. They are shared with the Board of Supervisors, and performance is shared midway through with the Board of Supervisors. In summer of 2022, we were able to hire the amazing team that I introduced earlier with Bella Sierra and Andrew Kanak to really create, and I would say at the beginning was the beginning of our launch of the Office of Racial and Social Justice. We also developed a community engagement toolkit with the Office of Community Affairs, recognizing that we needed to have community voice thoughtfully integrated into the decision-making processes of the county. And so we created a toolkit to make that available. And ultimately, in the fall, created a staff resource hub where while we're saying we need to have all staff and all departments bring an equity lens to their efforts, we also needed to make sure they had the access to tools and resources to empower them to do so. So the Resource Hub is an internal website where we hold all of the different toolkits, learning resources, updates, trainings. We have multitudes of trainings, and to make sure that staff have at any point along the way, they can go to the toolkit and access the resources that they need. Let's go to the next slide. In 2023, we launched a series of capacity building for our staff. So as I mentioned, we wanted the resource hub, we wanted those tools available, but we also needed to make sure that people understood what equity was and provided both foundational equity training as well as deepened trainings, whether there was 21-day challenges that we hosted or they were specifically focused on community engagement and other areas of focus. For example, unconscious bias is an area of interest and focus for our staff. And so we launched a series of trainings. We also began to pilot the integration of equity impact statements into the Board of Supervisor memos from our CEO office as a pilot. That means that in addition to the fiscal impact statement that is included in all board memos, we were saying that it's not just financial impacts that are important, that equity matters. So equity impacts for what the board was receiving were integrated. Therefore, the board could make their decisions informed by the equity implications as well as fiscal implications. We also started to communicate through a community equity bulletin and a staff newsletter monthly so that we were having the broad reach around our work as well as information that cities and others wanted to share available to staff in the community. We also began to integrate the equity competencies into our expectations for supervisors and new managers. We integrated an equity module for Essential Supervisory Series and our management development program to ensure that new managers and supervisors knew how to lead with an equity lens. Next slide. Coming into this year, as we're kind of starting to close it out, which is kind of wild to think about, we launched our second staff survey, really trying to understand, have we made any headway in the culture of the institution and how equity is viewed, understood, and advanced? I'll share a little bit more with you about that shortly. We also, a real pivotal piece here was that in May of 2024, we passed with the leadership of President Slocum and support from Supervisor Corso, passed the Equity Ordinance. The Equity Ordinance codifies many of the infrastructure and the tools and resources into our law, into county code. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. And in summer of 2024, with the support of Supervisor Mueller's office and Pine's office, we launched the design and resources for the Office of Labor Standards and Enforcement to ensure that low-wage workers were able to receive the wages that were owed to them. We developed the 3.0 action plan with our county departments. And then just looking ahead, in fact, the Board of Supervisors, President Slocum and Supervisor Corso on this upcoming agenda will be taking a look at introducing a local preference ordinance to prioritize local businesses, local small and micro business enterprises within our procurement as a county, again, doubling down on our anchor institution impacts. We're also exploring additional language access efforts, operationalizing the Office of Racial and Social, the Office of Labor Standards and Enforcement. And then one important factor in the equity ordinance is that we're going to be scaling equity impact statements across all of our departments. So starting in January of 2025, you will see that all board memos, any items going to the Board of Supervisors will have an equity impact statement in addition to fiscal impacts, not just from the CEO office, but from all of our departments. And we're also in the process of developing shared prosperity action plan with a diverse multi-sector collaborative that I hope to be able to share with all of you shortly. If you go to the next slide, I want to just pull this out because it is really critical to recognize that as a county institution, we are an institution of smaller institutions. And oftentimes those institutions don't necessarily connect with one another, but through our racial equity action plan countywide, each department identifies metrics, actions that are appropriate to them for the function that they serve to better serve that function with an equity lens. And we are in our 3.0 right now. That is also part of our equity ordinance and will continue moving forward. Next slide. I wanted to give you a sense through those departmental outcomes, just a sample set of accomplishments. So 7 of our departments over the course of the last couple of years have really invested in translating public documents and materials that they hadn't otherwise, or did not necessarily have requirements to do so from the state or federal government. Our medical center looked at their data and noticed that their Black hypertensive patients were not able to stabilize as well as their average hypertensive patients. So they developed a specific pilot listening to Black patients to better understand how can we serve our Black hypertensive patients better. And they saw improved outcomes through that pilot. County Health is looking closely at their data. So 6 of 7 of their client serving divisions are now disaggregating data by demographics to inform their planning, resource allocation, as well as their evaluation of how well they're doing. So it's not just an average number, but we need to know how are our subpopulations responding to our decisions. The coroner's office held trainings in partnership with our office around the rituals and cultural practices of death, dying, and mourning practices across multiple cultures and religions so that they can better be culturally humble and responsive when they show up in these difficult times for the diversity of families that we have in our county. Human Resources wanted to, in partnership with us, and this is part of our anchor institution strategy, wanted to remove barriers to the good jobs that we have here at the county. So they integrated skills-based hiring practices, removed any barriers that were merit-based that were not necessary for implementing a quality job, and they provided trainings for all hiring managers around that. Our Parks Department has for many years had hosted hikes in their county parks. And looking at their data with an equity lens, recognized that they really were not having the diversity of participation that our county has. And so instead of just holding those sessions at the park, they intentionally partnered with local trusted organizations in our lower income communities, particularly working with youth, to bring youth of color to our parks and intentionally program in partnership with those local partners who know their communities best. I'll also mention that our Department of Emergency Management established over 40 new nonprofit partnership connections to expand their reach into historically underrepresented communities so they can better respond to emergencies in our communities that oftentimes experience many inequities, and those are doubled down and exacerbated during emergency situations. In this next slide, I'll show you just some of the pieces of the equity ordinance itself. It's chapter 1.5 of the San Mateo County Ordinance Code to promote racial and social equity, inclusion, and belonging, and establish key responsibilities for county officers and employees discharging their public responsibilities. What's very important here to note is that this is the type of infrastructure, this is a policy that will live beyond any individual leadership, for example, any chief equity officer, any CEO. Mike Callaghy has been incredibly supportive of this work, but now it's codified as part of discharging public responsibilities with very specific individual staff responsibilities, institutional or departmental responsibilities, as well as structurally across all of our departments. What are some of those minimum expectations for ensuring that we are continually moving along our journey to advance equity? Next slide. I wanted to give you a little bit of an image of our resource hub to share with you that our intention always is that we as an office, the small 3-person office, are not the ones who are implementing equity. We are providing the infrastructure and leadership and support to the departments and the many staff and layers of staff that are actually implementing the functions of the county. And we're, through our office's Equity Resource Hub, we're providing and empowering staff with the resources, information, and tools to bring an equity lens into the operations. We're not saying you've got to figure this out on your own. We want to be intentional about having the tools that our staff need. And as we've been putting those together, you'll see in this next slide, just the fact that the puzzle pieces are starting to come together. The more we learn from our staff, from our community partners about the needs, the challenges, the more our departments start to build out their and advance equity and try new different actions, we better recognize what we need, what our challenges are, and how we fill them. If you go to the next slide, I wanted to share with you just the fact that staff are feeling the difference. These puzzle pieces that are coming together are being felt by the staff who implement the functions of government in this county. The differences that we saw from 2024, the staff survey we did versus 2022, were incredibly meaningful. We saw 81% of the over 70 questions that we asked show statistical significant difference in a positive direction. That means over 70, just a huge amount of the movement along this journey for our staff in feeling a sense of equity in this culture of the institution. 47% of those 81% of questions had a greater than 10% improvement. And just to pull one specific piece out, 88% of our staff reported the departments that they worked with provided resources to address inequities. That was up almost 20% from 2022. So I think this is a way of saying, the county, the departments are really putting their money where their mouths are. We want to make sure that we are being action-oriented, not just talking about it, not just pontificating, but taking action. And with that, I want to pause and just take questions and any feedback. I see one question right now that I will, so it says from an anonymous that, can you describe a time when you felt resistance to the journey and how you all moved forward? That's such a good question. And the truth is, well, there's many times, because I like to say that in my role in particular, but I think it's generally the Office of Racial and Social Justice, that we all play, in fact, the sandwich role, which is that we often many people feel like we're not moving fast enough, we're not going deep enough, we're not putting enough resources, and we're not saying everything that needs to be said. And equally, people feel like we're moving way too fast, saying way too much, going way too deep, putting way too many resources into advancing equity. So the biggest resistance is figuring out what the right balance is to move an institution forward and really managing that change so that it can sustain within the infrastructure and be institutional. I think that has been the hardest thing, and that resistance has come certainly along the way. I think one of the more challenging pieces of this work is just the fact too that there is so much to be done. When you start to assess the institution, when you start to look at the nooks and crannies of the work, you realize there's a lot we could do. But there's always resource limitations. If we want to be intentional, if we want to manage the change in a way that can sustain itself, that can be effective, we have to move the resources that we have in an intentional way, thoughtfully, and recognize that with urgency, but recognize that we can't take it all on at once. So I would say those are some key resistance. And I will just, because there's not any other question immediately open here, I'll also say that individuals have a lot of questions. And so resistance can be met through difficult conversations with leadership within the organization or externally with community partners who want to know, why do we need this? Who maybe don't feel like there are so many challenges with advancing with equity. So why do we need this type of investment? Why do we need this position or really need this type of focus? And so that kind of resistance is very normal. And I really welcome it because I welcome the opportunity for people to be honest with me about what they feel about the work and the opportunity to share with them my perspective on why it's important, why this investment in resources and time is valuable, and gives me the opportunity to frame it in a way that hopefully can be embraced so that our communities experience the impact of the investment within the institution.
And we did have one question come in of, as commissioners, where should we access resources and should we review those every year? From Anisha.
Wonderful. When I am not knowing what kind of resources the commissioners are looking to access, I will say that I think our boards and commissions, so one, to Manisha, thank you for your service. Our boards and commissions for the county, as well as for any government institution, are fundamental to how we have representation and community voice in the formal infrastructure of our county decision-making processes. So our boards and commissions are really critical, and having that kind of representation, especially for the diversity of lived experiences in our county, is critical. So anyone on this call right now who is not yet a part of a board or commission, I really encourage you to take a look at our openings, to reach out to me. We really would love to see more representation as part of our inclusive democracy. That said, our boards and commissions each have very different roles, whether they're advisory to the Board of Supervisors, whether they are advisory to a federal funding stream or to a department. They hold very different functions as well. So it's hard to say what kinds of resources they would be interested in accessing. But I would say that anytime that the boards and commissions can authentically bring an equity lens into how they are moving their priorities, how they are selecting their priorities for the year, how they are informing their advisory positions, is actually very important So we welcome the boards and commissions to more actively partner with us. I have also done many presentations for different boards and commissions, and I'm happy to join any one of the boards and commissions for our county to share more directly about our efforts and outcomes.
Sharon, can I also mention that we offered last year the foundational equity training to commissioners, and we hope to do that again in 2025. So it's the same training we offered to county staff, and we plan to do that maybe one or twice in 2025. So Anisha, to your question in the Q&A section, we hope to repeat that next year. So hopefully you'll receive the invitation when we are ready to promote those trainings.
Absolutely. Thank you, Belen, and thank you, Anisha, for the question. Just a couple of other quick points on this is that we also worked closely. So Connie Juarez DeRol, who manages our boards and commissions at a higher level and supports staff, we have a boards and commissions equity committee as part of our core equity team. And very intentionally, we went through and we did a demographic analysis of all of our boards and commissions to understand what kind of representation we had, what kind of gaps we had. We also revised the orientation and the welcome packet. The welcome webinar or presentation now includes an equity module as part of that. And as Belen just mentioned, we also are offering this foundational equity training. We also revised our boards and commissions application to be streamlined and to recognize different lived experiences, to be more skills-based, and to have a broader reach on for our diverse communities and be more accessible. Okay, I see we have a couple of other questions, and I want to make sure that we answer them. These are great. I can whip through the rest of it. Let's see. What has been the biggest surprise in the journey so far? This is going to sound a little bit, I will say, my biggest surprise is that I stay very optimistic, and that's been wonderful. I think that getting into a role where it's a brand new function for the county, something new to pontificate, something that frankly at the national level has been politicized. Such a topic like equity has been very divisive. But to be in a place to have these conversations and recognize that individually we hold these relationships that go beyond any kind of definition, and that people for the most part want to do what's right and good. And it's kept me very optimistic as to what we can proactively move forward. How can we recognize that government, it's not enough anymore to say that government will hold the line on discriminatory practices, but that we are in the business of advancing equity. And that has been very positively received to date. And I think in many ways, I was expecting more resistance and more challenges and maybe a little bit of a calcification in my general optimistic nature. I thought I might turn into a pessimist, which I haven't. Another question, who was your closest collaborator, partner in pulling together ideas, templates, or pulling your resources plans together? Oh, that's so interesting. Ultimately, the work in our county is done in departments for the most part. And our Chief Executive Officer, Mike Callaghy, is absolutely critical to the leadership that is felt by all of our departmental leadership. And so his partnership, him advancing the vision that I put forth, the theory of change, the actions, allowing me to move forward, has been absolutely critical and invaluable to moving this work forward. And then I will say, and then also having the Board of Supervisors. You can't move an institution without the institutional leaders because the leaders make those decisions. So thank you for those questions. And I want to just whip through this next sec, and so that you can leave on time, and just share with you some of the lessons that we have learned. And I think one of the, I spoke to some of this around the new functions of the county. Majority of county work is funded by federal and state dollars. And so taking on a new function is a real challenge without state or federal funding. We have been very lucky to be able to advance this work with resources such as additionally the Chief Equity Officer, Belen, Andrew, as well as some philanthropic support through CZI, which has been, and Silicon Valley Community Foundation, which have been absolutely invaluable. I mentioned change management. That's been a challenge to always be pacing things adequately. The politicization of the concept of equity as very divisive in this national discourse really does trickle down locally, sadly. Setting expectations for myself, equity-inspired staff around that pace of change, because we do feel the urgency of the need for this work and outcomes on the ground, and making sure that we work at a pace that is effective is really critical. Also, just the challenge of maintaining momentum and tracking the kinds of changes that we see. We have a lot of opportunities, and I wanted to highlight a few of those in this next slide around we're seeing the impacts. I shared with you some of those staff impacts. I also, for example, I think one of the most meaningful feedback I received from the community was hearing that for the first time, a community member felt seen within local government because they had an Office of Racial and Social Justice and a spokesperson, people who could talk about equity in this way, and it was ubiquitously honored through this equity ordinance and beyond. Providing tools and resources to operationalize staff, have equity operationalized. Having so many inspired leaders, galvanizing momentum externally to the county and internally, and the commitment that we've seen from our county executive's office, from our board of supervisors, and the many staff that really lead all of our work day to day. And that culminates in some of these lessons learned, which is that change management is very key in implementing equity. This is the next slide, Andrew, if you could go ahead and move forward. I come from a nonprofit organization. I have been an equity advocate in policy change at the federal, state, and local levels. I have been in research. When you're moving an institution requires us to be able to, in fact, understand how does change happen in an institution, and utilize that understanding to build our theory of change and our specific actions and strategies, so that we are not only reactive, but we are proactively moving an institutional change agenda to bring an equity lens into our efforts and do better by all of our communities. Celebrating wins to maintain the momentum, ensuring that even as staff changes happen, I mentioned that the equity work is built into our systems through the core equity team, through our countywide racial action plan, the equity impact statements, the equity and budgeting, so many of those things. And then while we want to see all of our departments soar, we want to also make sure that at the countywide level, we're keeping a minimum set of expectations for all of our departments, that you must implement equity in a minimum way in order to be part of what the values of what the county stands for. But we want the front runners of our departments to also make sure that they are running. And with that, I think I'll just pause to see if there are any additional questions in the last 2 minutes. And I will mention that we have a form, a feedback form and evaluation in our, Andrew has put it into our chat. I really welcome you to take this additional, this last minute to fill it out. There's a set of about 4 or 5 questions only. It shouldn't take you more than a minute to do. And also just know that we are your Office of Racial and Social Justice. And so while we wanted to be intentional about this presentation, to anyone who is interested, we want to hear from you at any point. We want to make sure that you feel like you If you have questions, you can reach out to us. If you have thoughts, you can reach out to us. We have this web page now where we are just starting, thanks to Andrew, to share back some of the work and have some of the resources available on our countywide website under the CEO's office around our equity work. And we'll continue to share more information on that website and continue to build it out. And then, how are we working with cities? For those who are interested, I'll just take the last 30 seconds to say that we bring the cities together quarterly, have done so for the last 2 years, have identified some core common institutional change requirements and needs that we have, and are quarterly advancing those and bringing resources to our cities and learning from them as well. Thank you all so much for joining us and taking an hour of your day. And we hope that you, if you haven't already, will make sure to vote and galvanize as many people to make their voices heard in this upcoming elections. Thank you all so much. I hope you have filled out the survey and visit our website. Take care. Bye-bye.